2015's Crimson Peak is the story of Edith Cushing, a young aspiring horror writer with the supernatural ability to see ghosts. Edith is an eligible bachelorette and the romantic interest of her father's doctor, a young physician by the name of Alan McMichael. But after the murder of her father by a mystery assailant, she becomes the target of a murderous scheme to sign over her newly inherited riches to a brother and sister duo with a dark secret, Thomas and Lucille Sharp. It marks Guillermo del Toro's first foray into the Gothic romance genre, a director previously best known for the fantasy films Pan's Labyrinth and the Hellboy franchise. Like Crimson Peak, these films demonstrate a similar visual style that heavily derives from the Gothic aesthetic. But this represents the first time Del Toro fully embraces a more traditional Gothic style to try and contribute to a genre that he often delves into and clearly shows a deep affection for.
I just felt I wanted to capture a feeling of the old movies that I saw. My first movie as a kid at age 4 was Wuthering Heights with Laurence Olivier. So it really imprinted in me. And when I was preparing Crimson, I was watching Spiral Staircase with Dorothy McGuire, Dragon Week with Vincent Price, Jane Eyre with Orson Welles, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to make this movie feel like that, to feel at the same time very old-fashioned, but with some notably modern gender politics and sexuality and violence.
Users of the review aggregator site Rotten Tomatoes criticise it for being a disappointing Victorian horror film and erroneously advertised as a bone-chilling ghost story. It seems that reviewers, audiences and even advertisers alike weren't quite sure of what to make of it. Some seemed disappointed that the film was not a more terrifying out-and-out horror story, packed with jump scares and a high body count, whilst others seemed to be simply unfamiliar with the kinds of text that Del Toro was drawing inspiration from. Rather interestingly, the extras on the Blu-ray disc feature a primer on Gothic romance, where Del Toro takes the time out to explain just what his film is meant to be.
Crimson Peak is not a horror film, it's a Gothic romance. Big difference, because Gothic romance was written by great women writers and make it about two points of view of love. Edith is one type of love, Lucille is another type of love, but one is liberating and the other one is suffocating.
And herein I think lies the issue. Put simply, this kind of traditional Gothic love story doesn't sit comfortably alongside the modern horror films of today, in a genre currently being defined by torture porn and films with little more to offer than shock value. But away from all that, this is a beautifully crafted film with an incredible attention to detail. But I want to focus on one aspect in particular, which perfectly illustrates the care and attention that has gone into every frame: the colour. From a storytelling perspective, the use of colour allows filmmakers to add an extra subtle layer of emotional content to a narrative. Be that the bright, colourful palettes of a comedy like Anchorman, to the muted, desaturated tones of wartime drama Saving Private Ryan, we derive unconscious implications from the use of colour which, when employed correctly, can infer extra meaning to scenes. But where does that meaning come from? To begin to answer that, we have to look at evolution. Russell Foster, Professor of Circadian Neuroscience at the University of Oxford, suggests that the development of the ability to see in colour came from a need for survival. The whole point of colour vision is not to inspire poets, but to allow contrast detection. You've got a much better chance of detecting an object against a background if you have colour vision. Colour vision allows for better contrast detection, which, in turn, means that it's easier to spot predators against a background, which, in turn, heightens an animal's survival rate. Colour then became a crucial determining factor in evolutionary development. Animals even developed their own brightly coloured markings as a means of deterring predators through the system we now call aposematism. Creatures which failed to spot or understand these colour-coded warnings from nature often died out, leaving the rest with an inherited series of assumptions about colour that increased the chances of their survival. And as human beings, we too benefit from these inherited assumptions, and it is this that the medium of film plays on to create meaning and narrative on the screen. When creating the film, Del Toro said he was inspired by
books and paintings and then by movies, in that order. I think that when I was a kid, I read most Gothic romances by Anne Radcliffe, by Matthew G. Lewis, by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who wrote Uncle Silas.
But perhaps the most obvious touchstones for the Gothic stylings of the film are Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and Charles Dickens' Great Expectations.
I don't try to reinvent it. I don't try to be postmodern about it and go, I know they do, and I just go at it very earnestly.
And in the design of Allerdale Hall, the Sharps' crumbling family mansion, you can see exactly what he means by this. Here we have a full embrace of the most quintessential Gothic tropes. The crumbling English mansion house, once resplendent but now a dilapidated symbol of better days, is evocative of Dickens at his most grand and Dickensian, and the harsh, isolated rural backdrop of darkest Cumbria reminiscent of the Bronte sisters in its bleakness. In the context of the film, the house is the malignant entity at the very centre of the dark tale. It is designed to be a character in its own right, a monstrous, decaying labyrinth full of danger, with a black past and built on unsound foundations. From a set design point of view, everything is meant to be claustrophobic and fear-inducing, right down to the wallpaper.
Around the house you will notice, hidden in the architecture, in the furniture, you will see the shapes of butterflies and moths. And everywhere, if you pay close attention, you can even make out the word fear, F-E-A-R. Yeah, the house is another character in the film. The house is almost asphyxiates the characters, you know. The characters get suffocated by the house, and it frames them quite literally, almost like a butterfly in a net.
This all reflects the lives of Thomas and Lucille. We learn in one scene that their mother was a domineering authoritarian who would forbid the children from entering the lower levels of the house. Her portrait still adorns its walls, forever looking down on them with a cold, disapproving glare.
Mother, she looks quite horrible. Yes. It's an excellent likeness.
The house, in part, seems like an architectural extension of their mother's personality, cold, oppressive, overbearing, and still very much a controlling influence in the lives of Thomas and Lucille. Just as she stifled them in life, in death their mother leaves them with this overwhelming burden that continues to oppress them. In fact, just as their mother's controlling nature drove Lucille to kill her, it is the state of the house that drives them into enacting their murderous plan. They lack the finance to keep it in a reasonable state of repair, and Thomas must repeatedly marry into money to maintain it.
Father was always travelling. The family fortune didn't lose itself.
The house is steeped in cool colours, mainly desaturated blues and greens. This firstly creates a sense of the house being cold, its dilapidated nature meaning that cracks and holes have appeared in the roof and walls, no longer offering sufficient protection from the elements. As winter sets in, the cold permeates through the house, and we, as the audience, experience this through Edith's first reaction upon crossing the threshold.
Does it look the part?
It does. Although it's even colder inside than out.
But that coldness is deeper than just the effects of the weather. It reflects, and in fact literally creates, the cold, loveless environment in which Thomas and Lucille were raised. If bright, saturated colours are indicative of warmth, energy and liveliness, then it's fair to say that through a childhood confined to the house, these would have seemed like alien concepts to the two children growing up under the eye of their stern mother. By the time Thomas and Lucille are adults, the house comes to represent all they have left, a crumbling, ramshackle facade of grandeur that they are only barely able to maintain, and a suffocating, forbidden love for each other.
You are monsters! Mother, you!
In essence, it's a physical manifestation of the culmination of their life's experiences. The colour blue is also used repeatedly in the costumes for Thomas and Lucille, to show them as being as much a part of the house as the brickwork and architecture. The design of Lucille's costume in particular, with its use of constrictive corsets and with her hair pulled tightly back, is evocative of restraint and suppression. In fact, so intrinsic to the house is she, that her dresses were designed in order for her to appear as though she was literally emerging from the walls.
Not for me, thank you.
Drink your tea. It'll warm you.
Green is commonly used as a signifier of illness, and as Edith begins to succumb to the poison which Lucille is secretly administering to her, the colour palette shifts away from blue and more towards pale, sickly greens. But it is also a signifier of envy, which we see start to creep in earlier on in the film, the first time Thomas gives her the poisoned tea. The camera pulls back to reveal that Lucille is spying on them both through a keyhole, and this shift in the colour palette represents not just Edith's sickness and poisoning, but Lucille's growing hatred of her. Later on, Edith becomes hysterical after seeing one of the ghosts, and Thomas suggests they go to the post office together the next day to get some fresh air. This scene happens almost immediately before Thomas and Edith spend the night together in the cabin, and where he fully realises his love for her. When they return to the hall, Edith is now wearing a light grey coloured dress with blue accents over the top of a bright yellow undercoat. This symbolic use of colour in Edith's dress, along with the newly confident way in which she carries herself about the house, suggests that she is now at least an equal to Lucille in Thomas's eyes, a fact that doesn't go unnoticed as Lucille betrays her usually ice-cold exterior for a moment, slamming the breakfast pan down on the table to confront Edith.
It's all a game to you!
And so we see for the first time the envy, which has so far only been suggested, made real. This eventually manifests itself in the final scene, where Lucille, having abandoned any attempt at subtlety, tries to kill Edith with a meat cleaver. She wears a pale green cloak over the top of her nightgown, literally covering her in her jealousy, as she maniacally chases Edith around Thomas's clay excavator before finally becoming the last victim at Allerdale Hall. Allerdale Hall is set on a foundation of red clay, and it is from here that the film takes its name. In winter, the clay seeps through the snow, colouring the hill upon which it is set a deep crimson colour, hence Crimson Peak. Beneath the house there are excavated pits where this clay is gathered and extracted. The pits make up part of a subplot involving an infernal machine, a giant steam-powered clay excavator that Thomas has designed for which he is seeking investment. It is his dream to sell the machine and be able to support himself and Lucille from the earnings, but his hopes are ultimately dashed when Edith's father turns him down. This sets in motion the events that lead to Edith and Thomas's marriage, a vital part of the plan which will entitle the Sharps to her inheritance should anything untoward happen to her. This is a plot which Lucille has acted out several times previously, murdering Thomas's wives and disposing of their bodies in the red clay pits. We see Thomas very explicitly tell Edith,
Never ever go below this level.
At a superficial level, this is simply a warning that the pit area is hazardous, but the clay pit's function in the film is more than just a place to hide bodies. It's also a symbolic representation of the horrible secrets that Lucille and Thomas have had to keep between them. Later, we learn of several artefacts relating to the murders that are kept down there: the gramophone, the chest with Enola written on it, and the cleaver with which Lucille murdered her mother. Thomas's warning, then, is a double entendre, also telling Edith to avoid digging up the past for her own sake. If the house is representative of Thomas and Lucille's lives and experiences, then the blood-red clay represents the threat of their dark past being uncovered. At several points in the film we see the clay seeping through floorboards and walls, even coming out of the taps in the bathroom at one point, which foreshadows the revelation that Lucille murdered her mother in the bath. The clay threatens to destroy the house in the same way that the secrets Thomas and Lucille keep could destroy them. It is only when Edith eventually ventures down into the clay pits for herself that the culmination of the narrative begins. She has discovered their dark secret, setting about the uncovering of their deception. Red is a signifier of blood, and in the film's colour scheme it also represents a violent and horrific past. The first time we see Lucille is at the ball in Buffalo, playing the piano. She wears a very vibrant red, in direct contrast to all the characters around her, which makes her stand out, but for reasons that at that point in the film we are yet to discover. All we know is that there is something unsettling about her, signified through the colour of her dress. This scene is a perfect example of how film plays on our inherent understanding of colour. Lucille is like an aposematic animal in the wild, brightly coloured and dangerous. She stands out to us because we inherently know that a bold, vibrant red that strongly contrasts with all the other colours around it signifies danger. We know she is a potential threat, even though we know nothing about her, and this is what unsettles us. Instinctively, we know she is not to be trifled with. Later, we see the colour red when we see the murder of Edith's father. As the blood trickles from the sink, we see a slow fade to a shot of the gramophone player on the side. We are yet to discover that the murderer is Lucille herself. The film hides the connection between her past and the colour red at this stage, but the shot of the gramophone foreshadows Edith's discovery of several wax cylinder recordings of Lucille's other victims.
Wax cylinder recordings.
Del Toro offers these colourful hints of red at several points in the film, and this is part of what makes up its many layers of storytelling. We see red again when the dog appears at the door of Allerdale Hall and, shortly afterwards, finds a red ball. It will later transpire that the dog belonged to one of Thomas Sharp's previous wives, who Lucille murdered. Thomas was supposed to have disposed of the dog, but it has returned, along with the red ball. Remember, red indicates a violent past, and this subtle hint is a hint towards both Thomas and Lucille's true intentions, and also their inability to escape from their past, which will come back to haunt them as sure as the dog did. Haunting is one of the key themes of the film, and it is explored very literally through the use of ghosts. For a Hollywood film, it has a slightly unconventional relationship with ghosts. Crucially to the narrative, they are not just there to be frightening. In true Gothic style, rather than pose a threat, they act as a supernatural guide to our wayward heroine. In a scene reminiscent of Jacob Marley in Dickens's A Christmas Carol, our first encounter with the ghosts is when Edith's mother appears to deliver a warning.
My child, when the time comes, beware of Crimson Peak.
Later, it is the ghosts of Thomas's murdered wives that guide Edith to make the discoveries that uncover the dark history of the house. This idea of the ghosts as a benevolent force might come from Del Toro's background. In Mexico, where he originates from, they celebrate the Dia de Muertos, or Day of the Dead, where the tradition is for families to invite the spirits of dead loved ones to return. The festival is one that encourages celebration and respect rather than mourning. To that end, Dia de Muertos is a day of joy and vivid colour rather than sorrow and sombre tones, and this, as well as affecting Del Toro's relationship with the supernatural, perhaps also provides some of the basis for the visual aesthetic of the ghosts in Allerdale Hall. The most notable thing about them is their colour, the same bright, vivid red that we have seen in the clay and in Lucille's dress.
I love the bringing in of the clay coloring and the red ghosts, these spectres being a tangible connection to this house.
Ghosts are frequently used in Gothic as an allegory for the past returning, and when combined with the colour scheme that Del Toro uses to embellish the narrative, they become an explicit reminder of Allerdale Hall's terrible history. Like the ghosts of Allerdale, the other ghosts in the story also use colour to give some clues to the circumstances surrounding their demise. Edith's mother, having fallen victim to a disease which has ravaged her facial features, appears entirely black, symbolising death and decay. Thomas, having been murdered by Lucille, appears as a white ghost, separating him from her other victims and suggesting that his murder was born of a different emotional state. And the final time we see Lucille, it is also as a spirit, playing her beloved piano in Allerdale Hall. Unlike the other ghosts shown haunting the house, she is blue in colour, symbolising her eternal connection to the house which dominated her life and forever holds her in death. In direct contrast to Allerdale Hall is the city of Buffalo, New York. Around the turn of the 20th century, when the film takes place, Buffalo was one of the most technologically advanced cities on Earth, and the opening of the film shows us the bustling, prosperous society which is home to Carter Cushing and his daughter Edith. The city is presented in warm, autumnal tones of brown, and it is here where Del Toro's inspiration from paintings is on display, specifically the work of John Atkinson Grimshaw, whom Del Toro references directly at several points in the film. This gives the city a very warm feel. In comparison to the inherent threat of the Sharp family mansion, Buffalo feels safe and friendly. The streets are lively and energetic as opposed to the bleak winteriness of rural Cumbria. Everything about it seems to be designed to be diametrically opposed to where the Sharps grew up. In fact, if we look at a colour wheel, we can see that the pale blue palette of Allerdale Hall sits exactly opposite the warm colours of Buffalo. There is a very pronounced and deliberate contrast between the two locations. One is warm and reassuring, the other cold and threatening. One represents busy, bustling life, the other isolation and death. There is also a thematic reason for this choice of palette. Carter is a self-made man who has earned his riches through hard work. The colour on display evokes earthiness and is symbolic of someone who has built his empire literally from the ground up. When we are first introduced to him, he is wearing a brown business suit and tie, chairing the meeting where Thomas makes his pitch to raise capital for his beloved machine. His costume, rather than making him stand out from the background, reflects his environment and position, suggesting to us that this is very much his world. He is in charge and he built everything you see before you in his own likeness.
My hands, feel them, rough, the reflection of who I am. Now you, sir, when I shook your hand, you've got the softest hands I've ever felt.
Thomas, in a dark desaturated green jacket, flowery cravat and with his soft hands, seems like an interloper in comparison, and this juxtaposition is the first inkling we get that there is some conflict between the two characters, a conflict which ultimately proves deadly for Carter. Warmer shades are notably absent later in the film when we get to Allerdale Hall, save for glimpses of them in the fireplace and the candles that Edith uses to light her way when exploring the house at night, both of which she clings to for reassurance as she faces the horrors of the house. Similarly, when Thomas and Edith spend the night in the cabin, the palette returns to warm hues, away from the danger of the mansion. The warm brown palette therefore represents safety and comfort. The one thing in Allerdale Hall that is vibrant and colourful is Edith herself. Throughout the film, she primarily wears items of bright yellow clothing. She also sports blonde hair in contrast to Lucille's black. Yellow is the brightest colour visible to the human eye, and it has connotations of cheerfulness, energy, youthfulness and optimism, all characteristics which reflect Edith's personality in the first half of the film. In Buffalo, her hometown, this sees her merge into the surrounding shades in much the same way her father does, but once she moves to England, the bright colours of her dresses contrast sharply with the washed out colours of her house, visually demonstrating how incongruous she is, both physically and emotionally. There is a recurring butterfly theme that runs throughout the film. We see them dying on the ground, in the wallpaper, and later on we discover that Lucille also collects them. The butterfly is symbolic within the film in several different ways. Firstly, it is a classic symbol of metamorphosis and represents the oft-touched upon Gothic theme of a young woman's change into adulthood. Edith emerges from her father's shadow after his death, becoming independent and marrying Thomas, which would almost certainly have been against her father's wishes, and eventually shedding her naivety as she uncovers more and more about her past. We see this represented when she returns from spending the night in the cabin with Thomas. We can still see her yellow slip underneath the grey and blue dress she wears on top, representing her move into womanhood and the change in her demeanour, but still maintaining an air of her youthful character. But the butterfly is also the Greek symbol for the psyche, a fitting visual metaphor given the narrative of the film. If, as Del Toro stated, the house is like a butterfly net ensnaring those within it, then their emotional state is the butterfly, trapped and helpless. This idea is specifically reflected in Edith's costume design as she enters the house for the first time. The dress she wears, again over the top of a yellow slip, has exactly the same colour patterns as the butterflies seen dying on the floor in the park. The moment where she crosses the threshold for the first time being analogous to being caught in the net. If we consider Del Toro's comments about the story being about two types of love, one liberating, one suffocating, and look again at the colour wheel, we can see once again that the colours in Edith's costumes diametrically oppose the colours of Lucille's dresses, chromatically placing the two characters at odds with each other as they compete for Thomas's affections. This competition climaxes in a literal fight to the death in the snow-covered ground of the mansion around Thomas's beloved excavator. The excavator serves an interesting dual role in the film, both as a motivator for the plot, but also as a symbol of Thomas's will and devotion. It places Thomas in a Frankensteinian role, as a creator obsessed with bringing his creation to life. To him, it represents freedom from the house and the possibility of a new start, leaving the horror behind.
We can leave, Lucille. Leave Aladale Hall. Think about it. We can start a new life. We would be free. Free, Lucille. We can all be together.
But he hasn't fully reckoned with Lucille's jealousy and, moments later, becomes her final victim as her passion engulfs her. Just as Victor Frankenstein's creation ultimately leads to his demise, so too does the infernal machine of Thomas's creation lead to his. The irony of this wouldn't be lost on his new wife Edith, who, earlier in the film, jokes,
Actually, Mrs. McMichael, I would prefer to be Mary Shelley. She died a widow.
In a film where red symbolises violence and death, love is represented by a pure, innocent white, and so we arrive at the final scene to find both Lucille and Edith wearing all white, encircling the excavator, fighting over the symbol of Thomas's devotion. Lucille also wears the green cloak, symbolising her jealousy, whilst Edith's nightgown is stained red around the bottom from the clay, suggesting that her love for Thomas is now tainted by the revelations of his past. The battle is resolved when Thomas's ghost, also white, reveals himself, giving Edith the opportunity to strike.
Lucille.
His ghost is tinged with brown, perhaps alluding to the comfort and safety shared between the two in the cabin. This final showdown is set up by a scene earlier in the film where white is used to reveal the forbidden love between the Sharps, with both Thomas and Lucille wearing white undergarments and bathed in pale moonlight. Edith too wears a white nightgown, making her appearance similar to that of Lucille's. Both women wear their hair untied, notable in Lucille's case as the first time in the whole film we see her without it tied up. This demonstrates her release from restraint. Gone are the corsets and the hair ties, and the real Lucille is revealed.
It's all out in the open now. No need to pretend. This is who I am. This is who he is.
Lucille throws Edith from the top floor as Thomas calls out to stop her.
Don't do it!
She breaks through the balcony before coming to a stop in a gathered pile of snow. The camera pulls out to show her lifeless figure surrounded by white. This scene is arguably the most important in the film, as it represents the coming together of several key plot points. Lucille's murderous nature, Thomas's love and concern for Edith as she lies on the snow, the clay underneath threatening to consume her, and we hear Edith's would-be rescuer impatiently hammering on the door, threatening to reveal them all to the world. Immediately after this scene, we have the reintroduction of Dr. Alan McMichael, also wearing white. His love for Edith has brought him to rescue her after discovering the truth about the Sharps. As he threatens to take Edith away, Lucille stabs him before urging Thomas to finish the job. Set against a white background of snow, Thomas redirects the blade so the wound will not be fatal and incapacitates his rival, tricking Lucille into thinking he's dead and, in her eyes at least, demonstrating what he is willing to do in the name of love. As he lays Alan down, the camera cuts to an external shot, revealing the extent to which the blood-red clay has stained the pure white snow around the house. The Sharps' bloody past has finally caught up with them. The use of colour within the film goes beyond the idea of just thematic implication. Del Toro cites Mario Bava and the Hammer horror films as the biggest influence on how the film looks and how colour tells the story.
The saturation is Hammer, 100%. And the photographer, the cinematographer and me, we were saying we wanted to do Technicolor on camera. This movie, I have color corrected this movie more times than any other movie I've ever done.
The rich colour and high contrast gives the film its unique look, an effect achieved digitally through the process of colour grading. Grading allows the filmmaker to digitally enhance the film or even introduce new colours into a scene. Digital post-production provides us with an incredibly powerful means of shaping the tonal content of the film afterwards, and, when combined with digital effects, allows Del Toro to turn his fantasy into a reality. But the technology behind the film is only part of it. All of that digital trickery is meaningless on its own and needs to work on an artistic, storytelling level if it is to enhance the film. Enter the influence of Mario Bava. Bava, a director plying his trade around the time Italy became the fashion capital of the world, used colour and contrast extensively in his films to shock and unsettle audiences in the same way that designers were using them to reinvent clothes. Prior to his work in Technicolor, horror films had traditionally been black and white. He saw colour as an opportunity to add an extra dimension to the storytelling. And in films such as Blood and Black Lace, we see both the influence of the Italian fashion houses and his exploration of colour come together to create a groundbreaking take on horror which would come to define the Italian giallo genre, which featured high contrast, bright colours and, for the time, graphic violence. A typical feature of Bava's films is the mixture of shocking, clashing colours which emphasise the horror scenes. The juxtaposition of these next to the other parts of the film which used more traditional lighting and colour setups shocked audiences and cemented his place in the history of great horror directors. Del Toro borrows from this idea extensively, and nowhere is it more apparent than in the shocking colours of the Allerdale ghosts against the cold backdrops of the house, the bright vivid red confronting us with a high contrast image that accentuates the unnatural presence of the ghosts. This idea plays out more subtly in other places, however, implying an even more complex emotional colour palette. In the context of the overall narrative, and outside of Allerdale Hall, Del Toro repeatedly uses a palette of cold blues and greens throughout the film to symbolise Thomas and Lucille's sinister intentions infecting other locations. In Buffalo, we see greens and blues start to creep into Carter's world of autumnal browns, upsetting the balance by introducing clashing, non-complementary shades into the mix. It suggests that Carter is deeply troubled by the presence of the Sharps, and the colours linger in his world like unshakable thoughts in his head. By the time he confronts Thomas about his previous marriages, he is almost enveloped in green, a stark contrast to their meeting in his office earlier in the film. Carter's murder also utilises this mixture of colours, where, as she does at Allerdale Hall, we see Lucille emerge almost out of the walls in a corridor highlighted in green and go into the bathroom area which is shaded brown. This colour palette works in reverse during the cabin scene, with the interior of the cabin lit up in warm browns and oranges, and the exterior a sour green colour with just slight hints affecting the two lovers inside, showing that Edith now has Thomas to herself. Lucille's jealousy is left out in the cold and overpowered by the earthy shades within. Where we see Edith and Thomas cross the threshold, winter is yet to arrive at Allerdale Hall, and the ground outside is still a raw brown colour. As Edith is carried inside, it marks a visual move away from the relative safety of the outside world and into the butterfly net, the pale blue world of inside the house. And finally we see the blending of white and red, signifying the clashing themes of love and violence that echo throughout the film. In Thomas's footsteps, in the staining of her clothes, symbolising her desperate struggle not to become another one of Lucille's victims, and after all the killing has played out, seeping through the snow, leaving the house to be engulfed by its past, and to forever sink into the bright crimson clay.